All right, thank you so much. I'm not gonna keep you between after this and wonderful talks and after party and probably party at Itaewon. So I'm gonna make it quick. Don't worry about it. All right, so we have 10 minutes. Okay. All right, so once again, my name is Doo. I'm a CEO and co-founder at StableNode, but I'm also a delegate at MakerDAO as well. So using those experience, we're gonna talk about more about governance, DAO, and all the fun stuff. People would like to think governance is boring, but I must tell you that it's actually pretty interesting. There's a reason why we don't need to watch Netflix. There's drama every week. Now let's go. All right. So when we talk about governance, right? A lot of different founders and teams, they when they think about governance and DAO, they like to think that all of their problems will just magically disappear. And then they say, like, for example, their token price is going down. They have an issue with lack of decentralization. I think that they will even talk about like world hunger and wars and stuff. And they just think that if we have a DAO, we can solve all of this at once, right? But if you look at the reality, is that when they talk about how we can become a DAO, they like to put basically name DAO or be like, okay, maybe we should write some pieces on how we think about like this decentralization. But in reality, not many actually want to become DAO. And then a lot of times they'll come to us and ask about like, okay, we really want to be a DAO, and we're like, great. And they'll be like, but what is DAO, right? So a lot of them like don't really understand like what is DAO, and that's fine. But at the same time, like if you tell them like some of the steps to become a DAO, then they realize that, you know what, actually, never mind. We'll just put the name DAO and just kind of pretend that it works, right? So what we realize is that the field of DAO is growing, right? So if you think about like many years ago, like maybe MakerDAO and some of the other like, DAOs were there, but it wasn't as diverse as now. Like now we have even like social DAOs, right? Like there are DAOs that focus on person or celebrity. There are also like NFT focused DAO. Few years ago, NFT was not so big, and then we even have like some of the some of the DAOs that focus on a specific issue. You guys probably heard about like constitutional DAO as well as like some of the other DAOs to help with some of the conflicts going on as well. So we're seeing that this field of DAO is becoming more diverse, and then the number of projects is sort of increasing as well. And then there's also a lot of like increase in some of the tools as well as projects that are there to try to help this kind of DAO and DAO management, DAO education, things like that. However, at the same time, despite the fact that number of these different companies and protocols in this field have been growing, there's still a lot of like experience and also a lot of knowledge that's kind of missing from this industry. And that's kind of where we come in. Because we see that there's a lot of different challenges when it comes to managing DAO and operating on DAO. And then a lot of times when we talk to some of the partners, they say they're like, okay, so what would be the right way to do it? And then we kind of tell them that, to be honest, there's no really right way to operate a DAO. There are just like many wrong answers, right? Because if you think about it, just like how we live, like, a lot of those issues don't really have a clear answer. Like, for example, you might have heard of a recent incident where, okay, so DAO decided that some of the venture capital they invested was not putting enough effort. So despite the fact that there was a legal contract, DAO decided to overturn it. And then is this something that's allowable? Well, that's, I think, a lot of like gray area that we have to see. And then we also see more clear examples of this kind of governance attacks, right? So some of those malicious actors might go into governance and then have some a proposal and they even pass it, and then nobody will notice it until it happened. And then there's also some of the questions about, like, okay, what happens if, let's say, token holders, they decide to get together and decide to do things that some might seem as hostile or some might seem as destructive to the protocol. Actually, for Venus protocol on Binance chain had a similar incident where the majority wanted to basically start a new project. So technically, the majority won, but they say that it was hostile takeover and decide to not follow it. Like, is it something that's allowed? And then, there are many different incidents that happen. And then once again, like, I don't think there's a right answer, but we want to explore how to make sure that at least it's more fair and at least more understandable, right? Yeah, so that's where like StableNode comes in, and then we have been helping with different protocols. So Maker, personally have been involved in, as well as like InstaDev, Clayton, the Finance, Balancer, as well as like Jet Protocol, and many others that are not mentioned here. So we might be helping as a delegate, or we might be helping as like a consulting, or we might be just there to hear their opinions and then just have discussions. So how we kind of approach this governance is that we believe that there's a theory and practice. Now, you probably remember back in college and then looking at your professor and thinking like, wow, this professor might be really smart, but everything he knows is theory and he has no work life experience. And when you talk about like, how does it work in reality, he or she would be like, well, actually, in theory, this might be this, but I'm not really sure, right? And then you've probably been frustrated once or twice. Kind of similar approach applies to in governance. We believe that it's not just about theory and having this research. You also need a lot of like real experience as well as somebody on the trench to be, for example, delegate or do this kind of governance consulting to understand like what the projects feel and then how they work. So how we have this kind of feedback is that, so we develop these theories, right? Like we have our experience others and then we develop this how to approach those governance theories. And then we have members working on practice. So we apply those theories to the practice and then see whether it works. So for example, we have let's say like new ideas, and then we encourage those who are in the practice to do it, and then they come back and say, you know what, it didn't work at all. I want my refund. This is a scam. Then we are like, okay, then we have to think again. And then we see that some of those are working, then we continue to do, right? So it is a working process where you need both theory and also practice. And then, this also applies to many of the different initiatives as well as projects that we're helping as well. So for example, for MakerDAO, a lot of people kind of come to me and say like, oh, isn't MakerDAO like a boomer DeFi? I guess that's kind of fair to some people who point that out. But I must say that Maker also has a lot of interesting initiatives as well as updates that are happening, right? And then, so when it comes to some of, let's say, big, new collateral that's happening that involves, for example, traditional banks and others, well, on the surface, it sounds good, but you have to also remember that in details is something that can take a long time, and that's also something that the governments need to coordinate between different players. So that's also something that we have been helping a lot as well. And then how we kind of look at how to have this kind of best practice, right? Because once again, for governance, there's no real right answer. It's just about how to minimize wrong answers, right? And then by doing that, what we do is that first we want to examine. So for example, we look at what's happening in the governance. And then two is that we want to, abstract, like for example, what's working, and then look at what's not working, right? And then we want to experiment more to see how it works. Each protocol is different. Now, some of them do share a lot of similarities, but to be honest, like for example, NFT, DAO and like DeFi DAO and like Layer 1 DAO, they're very, very different. So what we want to do is we want to experiment to make sure that at least there's more understanding of it, right? And then like a lot of times, just like experiment, sometimes it might fail and we feel bad and might drink soju, but still we'll try to go over and then experiment once more than others, and then we'll learn from our mistakes as well. So there are many elements of governance, and I'm not going to go too deep because I don't want you to, make it kind of boring. But basically, we kind of separate into 6, and then we are probably changing in the future as well. But first part is the voting, right? So when we talk about it, it's not just about like on-chain voting, but also a lot of off-chain voting, as well as like how to signal voting, right? Because we have to remember that if it happens that everybody is like, okay, I think this is a good idea, and every time they put into voting, then that's a lot of resource that's kind of, wasted, as well as we want to make it more efficient. So it's a question about, okay, how can you make sure that we have efficient, but at the same time have a voting that reflects those voices, right? And the second part is the communication. The idea is that, for example, if there's a voting coming up and everybody is asleep, then they're not gonna, for example, they don't know about it, then it's very hard for them to participate, right? So how do you communicate this kind of governance updates, for example, votings, as well as like what's happening to those community, as well as it can also apply to delegate side as well. So for example, if you have delegates or big token holders and they vote, you also want to make sure that they communicate that with the community as much as possible to at least understand what they're thinking. Like, who knows? Maybe they just vote something because somebody ran over their cat. It's possible. But at the same time, you want to know that happened, right? The third part is treasury management. This is very important because we are especially saw a lot of different DAOs and projects. They kind of misuse this kind of fund. And then while they're like Yak and both might be nice, we want to understand that this is a very precious resource and make sure that they're, like, for example, whether it's a multi-sig or different process to make sure the treasury is managed well. Now, the next one is the decentral workforce. This one might sound odd because a lot of times, even when we talk about DAO, a lot of them like to think it is like more like a foundation or a company. But as you become truly DAO, you have to realize that a lot of this workforce becomes like truly decentralized, and that the management becomes like very different. Like even from the maker side, I can talk more about it later. It's like, because for Maker, we don't really have a central foundation that members work in. It's like each team basically has their own company, and then that makes it more decentralized. But that also means the coordination is much more difficult, right? Because it's not like one company and there's the HR to say that you offended somebody. It's basically all the different companies and the different countries they're from, and different regulation and laws. So how can we make sure that we coordinate on this? And then 5 is standards and framework. This is more for especially mature DAO, because once you become more mature, and then once you have more proposals, you want to make sure that it's standardized, so it's easier for the community to kind of review and they compare, right? Because you can imagine that if somebody has too many ideas and then they put into voting or others, like, you want to make sure that it's efficient, and then also community can review it well by looking at, for example, key points, and then trying to make it more similar, at least in terms of application. Now, the 6th is not something that I think that a lot of projects know, but it's very important, is documentation. Basically, like, if something happened, you want to document like why it happened and what happened. Like, for example, if there's a voting, and then did the voting pass, okay, and passed by how many margin, what happened, you want to keep as many records as possible, as well as how to participate in DAO. The reason is that once you have a newcomers to a DAO, let's say, then it will be easier for them to get onboarded, as well as that you don't need to then spend resources to have somebody to basically explain what happened and things like that. It's also much easier for third party to look at it and gather data to give you more insightful feedback. So we believe that this is also very important. Now, in terms of voting parts, so the example we give, for example, it can be off-chain or on-chain, and a lot of these, like these days, because of the gas costs on Ethereum, a lot of them use Snapshot. But there are actually many others that besides Snapshot that people can use. For example, for Maker, we use our own, and then I would say that it has pros and cons. I would say that one of the pros is that if a protocol, like for example Maker, decides to create its own voting tool, then it also gives more flexibility, right? Because you can add things and the data, and then parts to make it more clear, or add the clarification. But at the same time, compared to Snapshot, you don't get as, like, for example, for Snapshot, because you get to see a lot of different protocols. So I would say that there's some data that's kind of shared as a third party they're doing it. I would say for Maker, it might be a little bit harder because it's like separate, right? But at the same time, it does give more flexibility. Or this is Aragon. To be honest, if there's anybody from Aragon here, like, I respect you, but I must say that it also sometimes malfunctions. And then first of all, I realized a lot of virus things, like the antivirus things that each virus. So I think maybe there's a mistake, but I have realized that it also causes some malfunction. So anyway, so we have some projects that also use Aragon DAO one, and then they've also been improving as well. So the point is that it doesn't have to be just Snapshot. Like, I heard that a lot of protocols, they know Snapshot, but just like there are many different options to do it. And sometimes you don't actually even need this kind of on-chain voting. Like, a lot of different protocols might just have an off-chain side as well. And especially in the beginning, that's also like might be okay as well. There's no really like right answer, like you have to use this tool. So now the communication is very important. So this, especially if you've been in like a DeFi a little bit OG, you probably know this story about basically a guy who found the sushi swap, and he's like, okay guys, don't worry, I'm not gonna rug, I'm a good guy, like look at my profile, I'm like a panda, right? And then later he's like, actually, you know what, I rugged, but I cannot comment because I'm like really high on drugs right now. And I would say that's a very not good communication. I mean, but appreciate it, right? So I mean, that's, I think the important part is like you want to communicate about like what happened, right? So I would say that for this one, like, yes, I'm biased toward MakerDAO. Like, I've been with Maker for like more, like yeah, around 4 years. But I'll say that like a lot of this communication has been done pretty well, right? For example, if you go to Maker Forum, you see that there are like different calls happening. So it's gonna write about like not just like time, but also like some of the contents that will be discussed, and then it also encouraged delegates like me to basically write down like my reasoning for vote. Like for example, if I vote yes, then okay, so what's some of the, for example, core value that I say that's related, and then I have to write down like what's my reasoning for it, right? Like technically, yes, I can write down like I voted no because he ran over my cat. I don't have a cat, so it's okay. But you can imagine that like I want to write it down so that people can see that like okay, I didn't just vote it because of like unfair reason, right? Like I have my reasoning on like because of this and this, it's fair, right? So that is very important, and this is something that we also encourage other protocols that we help to do it, because a lot of times voting happens, but then the reasoning is not really there. So this lack of communication makes basic community unsure about like why the voting happened and then what's the thinking behind it. And you want to make sure that that's in place to basically have it more transparent as well as more interactive as well. And then, once again, treasury management has become a very, very, very big issue. And then, it can happen in many different ways, right? Like, because we saw that some of the DAOs that are more immature or even like hostile toward investors, they might just engage in rug pull. But we saw that even if, let's say that you're not intentionally engaging in, there are like many issues that can, for example, harm your treasury, right? Like we saw that some of the treasury getting, for example, hacked. We also saw that some of the governance attacks to access it. So it's very important to make sure that like how treasury works and then how treasury is transferred. And then I must say that like there are also some cases that even if it's not like exploit like this kind of treasury attack, you might also have some proposals, and this is a common complaint / concern I heard from other protocols, and maybe you share the same. It's like everybody comes to your protocol, especially for like layer 2 or mainnet, and they want grant, right? Like because they know that you raise this amount, they know that you have this influence, and they also know that you want to have those DApps or other like programs on your like mainnet and layer 2. But at the same time, how do you know the fund is actually spent well? And if you think about it, if you give, let's say, a project or like a company, let's say like 1 million, but then if there's no really good way to make it accountable, then that's the same thing. It's not too different from getting attacked, right? Like yes, it's different in a way, like who did it, but at the same time, if there's no accountability, you're basically giving 1 million that you could have used for your team to a team that basically, they have used for, you don't know what happened, right? So it's also important that like for protocols, even if it's not like explicit attack per se, you want to make sure this kind of accountability as well as this transparency is there, because the community will ask about it, and if the community doesn't ask, that itself is a problem, right? Like you want to make sure that people question it, similar to how like in many governments, they'll be like, okay, where's our taxpayer money going, right? Like you want to ask that. And then in terms of the decentral workforce is interesting. So the example that I point here are actually not like DAO, right? Like those are centralized company. But the reason why I put those centralized company, for example, like Coinbase, is basically saying that like even for centralized companies, which in theory should be more efficient when it comes to managing people, like they also face a lot of hardships, right? Like they have to fire people sometimes. They have to basically go over some of those policies, HR and others. So you can imagine that for, let's say, DAO, it's even more difficult, right? Like, for example, like not just Maker, but for others, it's like, so when you try to lay off people in transparent way, it usually doesn't work well, right? Like, even for like Maker recently, we had the incident where team leader basically fired his other like team members, and then they gathered together and basically posted about like how they want to fire their own leader, right? Like, so like this DAO, because everything is transparent, it also means that like in traditional companies, they might be like, okay, like because of this and this, you're fired, and then like here's your severance package, like, and then here's like NDA. Well, for DAOs, like you don't even have a legal entity to sign an NDA, and then nobody's gonna really like respect it a lot of times, right? So that kind of challenges come out, and then we must say that it's like really different from project to project, but like increasingly as you become more DAO, it's becoming a more issue, because at the end of the day, like DAO is still run by humans, where like so a lot of human nature parts, as well as like incentive to, for example, sometimes engage in malicious act and then, for example, get punished for it, as well as like for those people to kind of expose something that might be harmful to the protocol, whether it's the transparency or whether it's like for the good. Like that kind of question has been come up a lot. So I must say that like for a lot of DAOs, it's not a big issue yet, but it's becoming a bigger issue as they become more decentralized. Because even for, once again, centralized company, it's not a issue that can be easily solved. So another point that I mentioned was about the standards, right? So for example, for Maker, we have a MIP, basically like improvement proposals. For others, they have different standards. But it's important to have this kind of standards to make sure that when you have a proposal, that it's kind of consistent, right? So we saw that a lot of different protocols might have something like, okay, when you make a proposal, you have to write like pros and cons. I think that those are kind of fair, right? Because by writing pros and cons, at least people can see, okay, like here are the kind of clear ones, as well as like if treasure is involved, you have to write down like how much is involved, like things like that. So those kind of like different standards can make the process much easier and smoother. All right, so this is another example of it, like for the Maker, like for example, this was about like, okay, now the delegate, so before delegates were not paid, but they want to make delegates to be paid. So here was the, like a different summary, and then they wrote about what would be the budget and then what would be the process, right? You want to be like standardized and also make it transparent so the committee can review it. And then yeah, this is about like, so this is also related to kind of documentation part. Is like, for example, many different protocols might be like, okay, we want people to participate in governance. Great, that's like the third step kind of. First step is recognizing that you're not a DAO yet, but it's okay, right? So what happens is that a lot of times people might want to engage in voting, but there's no real documentation on it even, like, right? So like, how can people go and vote? How can people go and make proposals? Like, how can people go and even challenge these kind of proposals, right? Like, a lot of times there's no real document on it, and then in the long term especially, this is important because as your DAO grows, you're gonna have more people engaging your governance as well as your community, and they're gonna have questions, and if you have to have somebody once again just to help them every time, like that's much less efficient than having like this kind of documents so they can review it, and if they still have questions, reach out to you, right? And then a lot of those documentation, because there are a lot of DAOs that also kind of wrote this, you can kind of have a standard version that will be easy for your DAO as well. As well as like, for example, keeping track of your voting and what happened as well. Now, so I like to say that decentralization is a step, and then I think even for MakerDAO was kind of clear case, because so some of the people realized that MakerDAO has dissolved last year, right? So, but the interesting part is that MakerDAO started as a DAO, right? So it started as a DAO like with Rune and then Nikolai and others, and then it became foundation later. So I also asked, and then many team members asked the team like why it became a foundation, and the problem was that when they initially started as a DAO, it was like very early, they didn't really have a process to make sure that people get paid even, or like this kind of process where like if you want to get investment, how do you make sure that you can get investment? Like this kind of legal document as well as like structure was not there. So they decided the foundation is at least like temporary measure to make that happen, right? So they became foundation, and then last year the team thought as well as the committee believed through voting that it's sufficient to be decentralized. So that's how it became happen. So now instead of, let's say, so traditionally, like even for foundation, you would have a team, right? Let's say you have a C-level, CEO or others. Maker still doesn't have a CEO level. Everybody kind of pretends they're CEO, but they're not. That's why they're fighting all the time, right? But then, so instead of like CEO, you basically don't have a leadership, but it's more of like composed of core units. So core unit would be each team, right? So for example, if you have a business team, then you're a business in a core unit. If you have, let's say, the core unit that works on smart contract, then you have a smart contract in a core unit. And for each core unit, you also have a facilitator. Facilitator is basically like a lead or like a leader in the team. So they will basically kind of represent the interest of the core unit as well as communicate and then be transparent. Another way of saying that they are also the people that, especially for delegates like us, you can imagine that delegates are like politicians. And then if you know anything about politicians, is that they like to criticize every time, whatever you do well or not. So it's kind of our job to just criticize facilitators, whether they do good or bad, right? It's nothing against them. It's just like our nature, I think. And then it's also their job, just like how we view politicians, to kind of hate us. But it's a good relationship, I'll say. And then we also have, for example, this kind of, creation of delegates. And then initially, this is also interesting point, is that when we first started delegates were not paid, right? So people thought that just you participating in like big DeFi itself is a worthy cause. I know we're kind of naive, but because what we realized is that this being delegate for billion-dollar protocol requires a lot of time, right? Like they need to not only attend calls, but they also need to vote, and they also need to review vote. They also need to think about like why they voted. So this kind of thing, we realized that they take many hours, and then in order to have this kind of healthy and also expert delegates, they need to be paid. So that's why we decided to have compensation for delegates, and we have realized that a lot of different protocols also start to move that toward that way, right? Because unless you have this, then you're gonna have delegates that are probably not so active, or even if they're active, they might be funded more by like venture capital, right? Or like so it's you want to have like very diverse background from delegates. And then we decided to have more standards. That's why we have the MIP, which is the standard for maker that we talk about. And then another thing that was interesting was that the question about the missions, right? Because now you became decentralized. You can imagine that in traditional companies, what do you have? You have CEO, right? So you have like, for example, people like Elon Musk or like Jeff Bezos, and they'll be like, you know what? I know I'm a little bit crazy, but this is my vision. We're gonna do it. If you don't like it, you can leave and stuff. Now in DAO, like we are basically like everybody's kind of equal, right? So nobody can be like, okay, we want to do this. Everyone needs to follow, right? Like then we don't have that. So what we have to do is basically the community members need to come up with some kind of proposal to how to like have this kind of mission, right? So right now, one of the big mission that has been proposed has been Rune, right? Like who's the former CEO of Maker. And then he has this idea for endgame plan, which in detail is very complicated. I think he can probably write a whole Bible on it as well. But the idea is basically like he wants to make sure that this is more structured in a way that there's meta DAO, and then all the core units become part of it, and then they have their tokens and others. So it's pretty complex, but that's kind of his vision and the mission. Then we also have, for example. Others that have different ideas. So for example, like Hasu, some of you guys might know, he had this idea for like simpler DAO, and then his idea is basically should have a constitution, which Rune also thinks it, but his idea is a little bit like, okay, we should just kind of maintain the current status quo, change the political landscape a little bit, and not changing too much about tokenomics. So we have like different ideas, and that's kind of the beauty of DAO. Is like you don't want to say that this idea is bad and just like silence it. Like that's not the point of DAO, right? The point of DAO is that anybody can come and participate, and it's not about whether like you think that you know the best. It's more about like you want to learn from others, right? So that's what's more important. And let's see. Yeah, so I'm gonna have like quick section for questions if you have time. But yeah, if there's anything like you can always feel free to reach out to me. And then this is true in a way, like there's no really a true DAO per se that's like in the end like you can improve, right? It's an ongoing process. And then I know that it's more sounds like a Trotsky or Lenin, but I'm just saying like this is something that you have to continue to struggle to become more decentralized and improve. So thank you so much. And then if there's any questions, I will accept it.